Richard Blackstone had everything money could buy: a penthouse overlooking Central Park, a private jet, and a financial empire worth $3 billion. At 52, he'd made his fortune in tech investments, always trusting his instincts and the expensive advice of Wall Street's elite. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, he found himself at the Riverside Cafe, a modest establishment he'd wandered into on a whim after his usual restaurant was overbooked. The place was unremarkable, with its checkered tablecloths and faded photographs of the city's old neighborhoods adorning the walls. He was accustomed to Michelin-starred establishments where servers knew his preferences before he spoke them. Here, he was just another customer, though his tailored Italian suit and gleaming Patek Philippe watch suggested otherwise. He sat alone at a corner table, scrolling through market reports on his phone, occasionally glancing up at the lunch crowd: working-class folks on their break, elderly couples sharing soup, students cramming for exams. His business partner had canceled their meeting, leaving him with an unexpected hour to kill. The simplicity of the place both irritated and intrigued him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten somewhere without a sommelier. A young black woman approached his table with a practiced smile, notepad in hand. Her name tag read Maya, and she couldn't have been more than 25. Her uniform was pressed and clean, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, and there was something about her demeanor, confident but not presumptuous, that caught Richard's attention. "Welcome to Riverside. What can I get started for you today?" she asked, her voice warm and professional. Richard barely looked up from his phone. "Coffee, black. And whatever your lunch special is." Maya nodded, jotting down his order. "The special today is pot roast with mashed potatoes and green beans. It's actually really good. My grandmother's recipe inspired it." Richard grunted in acknowledgement, still focused on his screen where red numbers indicated another market downturn. He'd lost $2 million that morning. Pocket change, really, but the principle annoyed him. As Maya turned to leave, Richard felt a mischievous impulse, the kind that sometimes struck him when he was bored. "Hey, waitress," he called out, louder than necessary. Several nearby diners turned to look. Maya stopped and turned back, her expression pleasant but questioning. "Yes, sir?" Richard leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing across his lips. "You look like a smart young woman. I'm having some trouble with my portfolio, lost a couple million this morning. What would you suggest I do with, say, $50 million? He watched her face, expecting confusion, maybe intimidation, perhaps even the starstruck awe he sometimes encountered when people realized who he was. Several customers had stopped eating, sensing the condescension in his tone. One older gentleman shook his head disapprovingly. Richard's question hung in the air like a challenge, a joke at the expense of someone he assumed knew nothing about real wealth. But Maya didn't flinch. She didn't laugh nervously or make excuses to escape the awkward moment. Instead, she tucked her notepad under her arm and met his gaze directly, her brown eyes thoughtful and unfazed. $50 million? She repeated, her tone measured. "First, I'd ask you what you're afraid of." The words landed like a punch Richard hadn't seen coming. His smirk faded. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Maya continued calmly. "In my experience, people with that kind of money who are asking strangers for advice aren't really looking for investment tips. They're looking for something they've lost along the way. Usually it's purpose or peace, sometimes both." The restaurant seemed to grow quieter, or perhaps Richard was simply paying more attention now. He set his phone face down on the table, something he rarely did, and studied the young woman before him with fresh eyes. She hadn't moved away, hadn't apologized for her directness, and somehow that commanded more respect than a dozen boardroom presentations he'd sat through that month. "That's quite a presumption," Richard said, though his voice had lost its mocking edge. "You don't know anything about me." Maya shrugged slightly. "You're right, I don't. But I know that look. My father had it before he died. He spent 30 years building a construction company, made good money, respect in the community, everything he thought would make him happy. But near the end, he told me he'd spent so much time building his empire that he'd forgotten to build a life." She paused, letting the words settle. "He said the richest day of his life was when he had nothing but managed to make my mother laugh after they'd gotten their eviction notice." They figured it out together, and that partnership meant more than the millions he made later. Richard felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. When was the last time someone had challenged him like this? When had anyone dared to look past his wealth and ask what truly mattered? "I'll get your coffee," Maya said, turning to leave, but Richard surprised himself by speaking again. "Wait." She paused, looking back at him expectantly. "Sit down. Please. Just for a minute." Maya glanced around the restaurant. The lunch rush had passed, and her manager was in the back. She pulled out the chair across from Richard and sat, her posture straight but relaxed. "I'll give you 5 minutes, but then I really do need to get your order in." Richard nodded, and for the first time in years, he didn't quite know how to begin. "You said your father built a construction company. What happened to it?" "He sold it 3 years before he died. Got a decent price, set up college funds for me and my siblings, donated a lot to community organizations that had helped us when we were struggling. He said he wanted to spend his last years actually living instead of just making more money he couldn't take with him." She smiled sadly. "Those 3 years watching him coach Little League, volunteer at the community center, actually have dinner with my mom every night, those were his best years. He told me that if he could do it over, he would have found that balance sooner." "So, what are you doing working here?" Richard asked, genuinely curious now. "With wisdom like that, and a family with money, why waitressing?" Maya laughed, not defensively, but with real amusement. "Because wisdom doesn't pay my tuition, and I don't believe in handouts even from family money. I'm finishing my MBA at night, working here during the day. My father's money is set aside for real emergencies, for building something meaningful, not for making my life easier when I'm capable of earning my own way." She leaned forward slightly. "Besides, you learn a lot about people when you serve them food. You'd be surprised how much human nature reveals itself over a sandwich and coffee. Rich people, poor people, everyone shows you who they really are when they think you're not important enough to put on a show for." Richard felt the sting of that observation. How had he treated her initially? Exactly as she described, as someone beneath notice, certainly beneath respect. "And your $50 million question?" he asked. "You started to answer it. I told you the first thing, figure out what you're afraid of. The second thing I'd tell you is simpler. Diversify your life like you diversify a portfolio. You wouldn't put everything in one stock, would you?" Richard shook his head. "Of course not. That would be foolish." "Exactly," Maya continued, warming to her subject. "But people do it all the time with their lives. They put everything into work, or everything into relationships, or everything into making money. Then when that one thing fails or feels empty, they've got nothing else to stand on. My father taught me that before he died. He said, 'Maya, make sure you're rich in the things that matter: friendship, purpose, health, learning, love. Money's just one ingredient in a good life, not the whole recipe.'" She glanced at her watch. "Look, mister, I didn't catch your name, but here's what I'd do with $50 million if it were mine. I'd invest a third in solid, boring, long-term growth. Index funds, real estate, the kind of stuff that won't make you rich overnight but won't disappear either. I'd put another third in people and causes, education initiatives, small business loans in underserved communities, things that grow wealth for others because that comes back to everyone eventually. And the last third? I'd use to buy time." "Buy time?" Richard echoed, confused. "How do you buy time?" "You buy it by not having to constantly chase more money. You buy it by paying people to do the things you hate so you can do the things you love. You buy it by saying no to opportunities that pay well but cost you your peace." Richard sat back, genuinely stunned. This young woman, this waitress he'd tried to mock minutes ago, had just articulated something his high-priced advisors never had: a philosophy that transcended mere wealth accumulation. "That's actually brilliant," he admitted. "Where did you learn to think like that?" Maya smiled. "Poverty is a great teacher, Mr. Blackstone. Richard Blackstone. Mr. Blackstone," she continued, "when you grow up with nothing, you learn early that money isn't the answer to every problem. Yes, it solves logistical problems, keeps the lights on, puts food on the table. But I've seen people with nothing who are genuinely happy, and I've served plenty of wealthy customers who looked more miserable than anyone in the projects where I grew up." She stood up, preparing to finally put his order in. My father used to say that poverty taught him what he needed, and wealth taught him what he didn't. That's wisdom you can't buy, Mr. Blackstone. You have to earn it through living, through failing, through paying attention to your life instead of just your bank account. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. I'd like to talk with you again. Seriously. Not as a customer and a waitress, but as someone who could learn from your perspective. Maya looked at the business card. Blackstone Capital Group, CEO and founder, and her eyes widened slightly. You're that Richard Blackstone, the tech investor. He nodded, feeling oddly embarrassed by his earlier behavior. I am. And I was rude to you earlier. I apologize. I tested you unfairly, treated you dismissively, and you responded with more grace and wisdom than I deserved. Apology accepted, Maya said simply, pocketing his card. But I have a condition if we're going to talk again. Name it, Richard said immediately. Don't offer me a job. I've got to finish my degree my own way, earn my credentials, build my own foundation. What my father taught me that only means something because I'm living it, not because someone handed it to me on a silver platter. Richard felt a smile tugging at his lips, a genuine one, not the practiced expression he used in business meetings. Fair enough. But I do want to talk with you again. Maybe you could tell me more about this MBA you're working on. What's your focus? Sustainable business practices and community investment, Maya replied. I want to figure out how to make capitalism work for everyone, not just the people who already have capital. That's ambitious, Richard said. Some would say impossible. Some people said a black girl from the projects couldn't get into a top MBA program either, Maya countered with a slight smile. I've gotten used to proving people wrong. She headed toward the kitchen, calling back over her shoulder, I'll get that coffee and pot roast right out to you, Mr. Blackstone. And think about what I said. What are you afraid of? Because until you answer that honestly, no amount of money is going to fix what's really broken. Richard sat alone at the checkered table, his phone still face down, forgotten. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about market positions or quarterly earnings or the next big deal. He was thinking about Maya's question, about her father's wisdom, about the poverty of a life rich only in dollars. When she returned with his lunch, the pot roast steaming and fragrant, Richard looked up at her with newfound respect. Thank you, Maya, for the food and for the conversation. Anytime, Mr. Blackstone, she said warmly. That's what we're here, for, feeding people. Sometimes it's just their stomachs that need it, but sometimes it's more than that. As Richard took his first bite and found the pot roast truly was as good as she'd promised, he realized that he'd walked into this restaurant as one person and would walk out as another. A billionaire had asked a waitress for financial advice as a joke, but her first words had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about wealth, success, and what it truly meant to be rich.